Picture a house next to a small stone church, somewhere in Europe, around the year 1000. It is early. There is a fire going, and a woman is stirring something over it. And there are children, two of them arguing in the doorway about whose turn it is to fetch something, and a smaller one underfoot. And the man of that house is the priest of that church. That is his wife. Those are his sons. And here is the part that matters. Nobody in that village finds this strange. Not the neighbors, not the bishop, not the children themselves. This is simply what a parish looks like. It has looked like this in most of the West for about 1,000 years, and it will go on looking like this for another century or so. And then, within a couple of generations, it will be gone. And it will become so completely gone that 1,000 years later, most people will assume it was never there at all. So the question this video exists to answer is, who ended it and why? And the second half of that question has an answer that almost nobody tells you, and it is not the answer you would expect. And this is exactly the kind of change Paul spent his life watching for, writing to the churches in Galatia. I marvel that ye are so soon removed from him that called you into the grace of Christ unto another gospel. So soon. And then the heaviest sentence in his letters, that even if he himself or an angel from heaven brought a different gospel, let him be accursed. Galatians chapter 1. Not attacked, renovated. 3 parts today. First, what the New Testament actually says about a church leader and marriage, and it is much stronger than most people realize, because it does not permit it, it requires it. Second, and this is the strongest of the 3, so stay for it, a passage where Scripture predicts this exact prohibition, by name, in a list you will not want to be on. And third, what happened, and the reason behind it that is usually left out, which involves property. And before I go one step further, let me be clear about what I am not saying, because I would be ashamed to be misheard on this. I am not against celibacy. The Bible honors it. Paul was unmarried and said he wished more men were like him. Jesus spoke about those who choose that life for the kingdom's sake. Men and women who have given up marriage to serve God have done extraordinary things, and I have met some of them, and they humble me. This video is not about celibacy. It is about compulsion, about the difference between a gift a man chooses and a condition an institution imposes. And one more thing, and I mean it. This video contains nothing about anybody's private conduct. Not modern, not historical. I am talking about a rule and where it came from, and that is all. Anyone who wants a video about scandal will have to get it somewhere else. Before the first one, 2 quick things, and then I will not interrupt the scripture again until the end. First, make sure you are already subscribed, so the next one does not slip past you. And tell me in the comments which city you are watching from tonight. I read them, all of them, and I pray for the names of the places I see. And second, let me be honest about where this comes from. What I am about to walk you through, I did not learn in a seminary. I learned it the hard way, at a kitchen table with an open Bible, the day I read the qualifications for a church leader in 1 Timothy and realized I had been taught the opposite of what the verse says. I wrote all of it down, every verse, every test, in a short guide I called Be Your Own Pastor. Keep the title in the back of your mind. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why I had to write it. Now, the first one. And here is the one thing I want you to carry out the door. When a rule and the Bible disagree, the rule always has a history, and the history is almost never spiritual. That is the pattern this channel keeps running into. Somebody, at some point, needed a problem solved, and the solution was announced in the language of holiness. And the way you find it is always the same. Read the verse, then ask who benefited from the rule. Part 1. What the New Testament actually says. And I want to start with the sentence that stopped me. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. Paul is listing the qualifications for a bishop, an overseer, an elder, the leader of a congregation. And he writes, a bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach. A bishop then must be. This is not a paragraph about what a leader is permitted to do. It is a list of requirements. Must be blameless, must be vigilant, must be sober, must be apt to teach. And sitting in the middle of that list of requirements is the husband of one wife. And Paul says it twice. Titus chapter 1 verse 6, giving Titus instructions for appointing elders in every city. If any be blameless, the husband of one wife, having faithful children. The husband of one wife, having faithful children. And then in verse 7, he explains the reason, in the passage a few verses down in 1 Timothy. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God? The household is the training ground. The way a man treats his wife and raises his children is the evidence that he can be trusted with a congregation. Now, hold that against a rule that says a man may not have a wife or children at all, and feel the size of the gap. It is not that the rule adds a discipline the Bible did not require. It is that the rule removes the very qualification the Bible does require, and then removes the evidence Paul said to look for. And this is not a matter of interpretation, because we can look at the men themselves. Matthew chapter 8, verse 14, one of those tiny verses that decides an argument. And when Jesus was come into Peter's house, he saw his wife's mother laid and sick of a fever. Peter's wife's mother. Peter was a married man. The man every claim of succession runs through had a wife, and Jesus healed her mother in their house. And Paul confirms it was normal and ongoing, decades later, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5, where he is defending the rights of apostles. Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as other apostles, and as the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Cephas is Peter. Paul says the other apostles, the Lord's own brothers, and Peter, traveled with their wives, and he says it as an argument that he would have every right to do the same. So in the New Testament, marriage among leaders is not tolerated. It is required, it is modeled, and it is defended by Paul as a right. Part 2, and this is the strongest thing in this video. And the first time I read it in this context, I had to put the book down. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verses 1 to 3. Same letter, one chapter later. Paul writes, Now the Spirit speaketh expressly, that in the latter times some shall depart from the faith, giving heed to seducing spirits, and doctrines of devils, forbidding to marry, and commanding to abstain from meats, which God hath created to be received with thanksgiving of them which believe and know the truth. Forbidding to marry. That phrase is in a list, and look at the list it is in. Departing from the faith, seducing spirits, doctrines of devils. And the two examples Paul gives of what that looks like in practice are forbidding marriage and commanding abstinence from certain foods. I want to be careful here and say exactly what I mean, because this verse can be swung around like a club. Paul is describing a prohibition, a rule imposed on people by an authority. He is not describing a man who freely chooses not to marry, because 2 chapters of this same Bible are devoted to honoring exactly that choice. The word is forbidding. Somebody is not allowed. And Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4 adds the other half in 5 words. Marriage is honorable in all. In all. Not honorable in most. Not honorable except for a category of men who are set apart. In all. So here is the situation in front of us. In one letter, Paul makes marriage a requirement for church leadership. 1 chapter later, in the same letter, he lists forbidding marriage as a mark of departing from the faith. And about 1,000 years later, the institution made forbidding marriage the permanent condition of church leadership. And this is exactly the kind of thing I had to find on my own, alone, with the text open, because nobody whose office depends on a rule will read you the verse that names the rule. It is the reason the second protocol in that short guide I wrote is about testing a requirement against the qualification list Scripture actually gives. But back to the history, because now we get to who and why. And there is one more thing worth noticing about where that sentence sits. Paul says the Spirit speaks expressly, plainly, in so many words about this. He is not offering a private opinion or a cultural preference. He flags it as something explicitly warned. And then he gives 2 examples, and the 2 go together in a way that should make us look twice. Forbidding to marry and commanding to abstain from meats. Marriage and food. 2 of the most ordinary, physical, God-given parts of being a human being. And the pattern he warns about is a religion that gains authority by restricting the ordinary. That is the shape of it. Not by adding worship, by taking away bread and taking away a wife, and calling the subtraction holiness. Part 3. What happened? And I will round every date down, because the argument does not need precision it cannot defend. For roughly the first 1,000 years in the West, married clergy were ordinary, not universal. There were monastic movements and regional rules and long-running arguments, and voluntary celibacy was widely admired. But a village priest with a wife and children was a normal sight for a very long time, and the sons of clergy were normal people with normal inheritances. Then, at the beginning of the 12th century, two councils settled the matter permanently. The rule was not merely that clergy should not marry, it was that clerical marriages were not valid. That is the moment the door closed. And notice what that means for the households that already existed. It did not only prevent future marriages, it reclassified existing wives and existing children retroactively with a stroke. And now the part that almost nobody tells you, and it is the reason I made this video. There was a genuine reform movement in that era, aimed at real corruption, the buying and selling of church offices, absentee clergy, and other abuses, and many of the men driving it were serious about holiness. That is true, and I am not going to flatten it. But there was also a property problem. When a priest had sons, those sons inherited, and what they inherited included land, buildings, and in practice, the office itself, passed down like a family trade. Across centuries, that meant church property was steadily flowing out of the institution and into families, and parishes were becoming hereditary estates. A celibate clergy has no heirs, and a clergy with no heirs cannot alienate property. Everything stays. Now, I'm not telling you that was the only motive, and I'm not telling you the men involved were cynics. The record does not support either claim, and I will not make it either. What I am telling you is that this is a documented factor, discussed openly by historians, and it is almost never mentioned when the rule is taught to ordinary believers. And that omission is the point. Because look at what we are left with. A rule that Scripture explicitly names as a mark of departing from the faith also happened to solve a very large financial problem for the institution that imposed it. When those two things line up, you do not need to accuse anybody of anything. You simply have to ask the honest question: which of the two motives kept the rule in place for 900 years? And let me say my guard again, because it is more important to me than the argument. Celibacy chosen is a gift, and Scripture honors it. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7 that he wishes all men were as he is, and that a man who is unmarried can care for the things of the Lord with an undivided attention. Jesus, in Matthew 19, speaks of those who choose that life for the kingdom of heaven's sake, and then adds one line that decides this entire subject. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. He that is able to receive it. That is the language of a gift being offered to whoever can carry it. It is not the language of a requirement applied to everybody who wants a job. Jesus attached a condition, being able, and left the receiving to the man. The rule removed both. And let me deal with the fairest objection, because there is a good one, and it deserves an answer rather than silence. Somebody will say, the phrase husband of one wife does not mean he must be married. It means that if he is married, he must have only one wife. It is a rule against polygamy, and against a man with a complicated marital history, not a command to marry. And that reading is held by serious people, and it is not silly. So let me give it its due, and then tell you what it does not solve. It is true that the phrase functions as a limit, one wife, not several, and a settled household. Fine, but look at what surrounds it in the paragraph. Paul immediately goes on to talk about the man's children, and how he rules his own house, and says that if a man cannot manage his own household, he cannot take care of the church of God. That reasoning does not work on a man with no household, and Titus adds having faithful children in the same breath. The whole passage is built on the assumption that there is a wife and there are children to look at. So even on the most generous reading of that phrase, you arrive at this. The New Testament plainly assumes married leaders, gives instructions that only make sense for married leaders, and never once hints at a prohibition. Which means the objection can rescue the phrase, but it cannot rescue the rule. You can argue about whether Paul commanded marriage. You cannot argue that he forbade it, because one chapter later he tells you who does. So let us put the three parts together. The New Testament requires that an overseer be the husband of one wife, and says so twice, and gives the reason. A man's household is the evidence. Peter had a wife, and Paul says the apostles traveled with theirs. One chapter after making it a requirement, Paul lists forbidding marriage among the marks of departing from the faith. And 1,000 years later, The very thing named on that list became the permanent condition of holding office, in an era when the alternative was watching church property leave with somebody's sons. So let me ask you the real question, and I want you to answer it honestly, in the quiet, before you do anything else. What rule are you under that you have never once looked up? Not a doctrine you have debated, a rule. Something about who may lead, who may serve, who may speak, who may take communion, who may remarry, what a serious Christian does and does not do. Pick the one you are most certain about and go and find its verse tonight. Because if a rule this large, held this long by this many people, sits in direct contradiction to two verses in the same letter, then the number of people who believe something and the number of centuries they have believed it are not evidence of anything at all. And if that landed on you, if you have accepted a whole structure of requirements you were never shown in the text, and underneath it the deeper fear of standing before God one day, having obeyed every rule but the ones he actually gave, and hearing the most terrible sentence in the whole Bible when Jesus says to religious, certain people, "I never knew you, depart from me," then let me point you toward the next step, because I am not going to leave you with only a feeling. Everything we walk through today, I wrote out plainly in that short guide, Be Your Own Pastor. It is where I put the 3 protocols in order: how to read Scripture for yourself with nobody standing between you and God, how to test a requirement against the qualification list Scripture actually gives, and how to make the decisions of your own faith without asking a man's permission. I even put the verses on the priesthood of every believer in there, in the original Greek. I am not going to put a number on it here. Go and see for yourself. It is linked right below this video, and there is a code on your screen right now that takes you straight to it. I made it for the believer who is done depending on any pulpit but Christ's. Now, before we close, if this channel has been feeding something real in you, do 2 small things for me. Make sure that subscribe button is on and the bell with it, so the next thing I open finds you. And if you want to help us put this in front of people who have never once been shown the qualification list in 1 Timothy 3, you can tap join and become a member of this ministry. Think of it only as sowing into the work, nothing more than that. And if you cannot, you are still family here, fully. Either way, stay. The next video I am putting in front of you right now is the honest next step from here. Because once a rule this size can be added to the office, the question becomes what else was added to it? Go watch it while this is still burning in you. And until then, go and read 1 Timothy chapter 3, slowly, the whole list, tonight. It takes 4 minutes, and it is the job description for the man who stands in front of you every week. May the peace of Christ, who honors the man who gives up marriage and never once demanded it, keep your heart and your mind until we open the Word together again.